Global Nightmares Tales from the Midnight Highway. Have you ever felt an unexplainable presence watching you on a deserted highway at 3 a.m. when the only company is your headlights cutting through the darkness and the shadows on either side of the road seem to shift and move with a life of their own? Today we're diving into 4 bone-chilling supernatural encounters from highways around the world. From Mexico's haunted mountain passes to Argentina's phantom hitchhikers, these aren't just stories, they're warnings from those who ventured into places where the veil between worlds grows thin. Turn off your lights, put your headphones on, and whatever you do, don't look in your rearview mirror. The Last Red Light. If anyone had asked Alejandro Vega what he thought about ghost stories, he would have laughed. At 28, working as an accountant in one of Mexico City's most prestigious firms, Alejandro dealt in numbers, facts, and the cold hard reality of financial statements. Supernatural tales were for children, and the superstitious elderly like his grandmother who still placed salt across her doorway to ward off evil spirits. That night, as rain pelted the windshield of his Honda Civic, Alejandro wasn't thinking about ghosts or spirits. His thoughts were consumed by the phone call that had dragged him from his apartment at 2 a.m. His father had suffered a severe heart attack and was in critical condition in a hospital in Veracruz. The doctors weren't sure if he would make it through the night. "You should wait until morning," his boss Ricardo had warned when Alejandro called to say he wouldn't be in tomorrow. Driving the mountain roads to Veracruz in this weather is suicide, especially at this hour. But Alejandro couldn't wait. His relationship with his father had been strained for years, fractured by Alejandro's decision to move to the capital instead of taking over the family business. If these were his father's final hours, Alejandro couldn't bear the thought of not being there, of not having one last chance to make amends. So here he was, coffee thermos in the cup-holder windshield wipers, fighting a losing battle against the torrential downpour, and the highway ahead barely visible beyond the reach of his headlights. The radio crackled with static as he scrolled through stations, finally settling on an old bolero that reminded him of road trips with his father when he was young. 2 hours into the journey, Alejandro's eyelids grew heavy. The monotonous rhythm of the wipers combined with the gentle melody from the radio created a dangerous lullaby. He cracked his window, letting the cool, rain-scented air slap at his face. He couldn't afford to fall asleep. Not here, not now. As the road began to climb into the mountain range that separated Mexico City from Veracruz, the storm intensified. Lightning illuminated the sky in brilliant flashes, briefly turning night to day, revealing the sheer drops that bordered the narrow mountain pass. In those moments, Alejandro could see the lack of guardrails on the hairpin turns, nothing but empty space and a fall that would certainly be fatal. "Just a few more hours," he muttered to himself, gripping the wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening. "Just hold on, Dad, I'm coming." The road grew increasingly treacherous as he ascended. Fog began to mix with the rain, reducing visibility even further. Signs warning of dangerous curves flashed by their reflective surfaces, gleaming ominously in his headlights. Alejandro slowed down now, crawling at 30 kilometers per hour, straining to see the road ahead. It was during one particularly dense patch of fog that Alejandro saw the first sign something was wrong. His headlights caught a roadside shrine, a common sight in rural Mexico, often marking locations where travelers had met with tragedy. This one contained a statue of the Virgin Mary surrounded by candles that impossibly burned despite the rain and wind. Fresh flowers sat at the base, bright red against the gray of the stone. Alejandro felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Who would come to this remote spot to leave fresh flowers and light candles? Who could keep them burning in this storm? His radio suddenly shifted from the gentle bolero to harsh static, then silence. Alejandro reached to adjust it, then froze as a voice emerged from the speakers, not a radio announcer or singer, but something that sounded like an old recording, tinny and distant. "The road claims another," it whispered in Spanish. "El camino de los suspiros welcomes you, Alejandro," the road of sighs. Alejandro had never heard this name before, but it sent another chill down his spine. He jabbed at the radio's power button, and to his relief it went silent. "Just my imagination," he muttered. Too much coffee and too little sleep. As he rounded the next curve, his headlights illuminated something in the middle of the road that made him slam on the brakes. The car skidded on the wet pavement, hydroplaning briefly before coming to a stop just short of what had appeared. In the middle of nowhere on this remote mountain pass stood a traffic light. Not a construction signal or a temporary fixture, but a full traffic light like one would find in a city intersection. It was old-fashioned, the metal pole rusted and weathered as if it had stood there for decades, and it was showing a steady red light. Alejandro blinked hard, convinced he must be hallucinating from fatigue. But when he opened his eyes, the traffic light remained, its red glow cutting through the fog and rain reflecting off the wet asphalt. "This is insane," he said aloud. "There's no intersection here, no crossing road, just a single mountain pass." Yet there it stood, and despite the absurdity of it, Alejandro found himself waiting foot on the brake. He glanced at his watch, 1:15 a.m. His father's condition might be deteriorating by the minute. "I don't have time for this," he said, but made no move to drive on. Something about that red light held him there, an instinct deeper than logic. As he sat contemplating whether to ignore the light and continue, a pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. Another car approaching from behind. Relief flooded through Alejandro, another human being on this desolate stretch, confirmation that he wasn't losing his mind. The approaching car, an old Volkswagen Beetle from the 1970s, pulled up beside him, its pale blue paint barely visible in the dim light. The driver, a woman with silver hair neatly tied in a bun, rolled down her window and motioned for Alejandro to do the same. Senora, Alejandro called through the crack in his window. "Do you know what this traffic light is doing here?" The woman regarded him with dark eyes that seemed to hold a profound sadness. "It stops those who need to be stopped," she said, her voice surprisingly clear despite the storm. "It's been here since I can remember." "But there's no intersection," Alejandro protested. "Not all crossings are between roads, young man." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Your father is ill, isn't he? That's why you're traveling at this dangerous hour." Alejandro felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "How did you know that?" "I know many things about those who travel this road at night," she replied. "I could give you a ride to the next town. Your car doesn't sound well." As if on cue, Alejandro's engine sputtered, the dashboard lights flickering momentarily before stabilizing. He hadn't noticed any problems with his car before, but now that she mentioned it, he could hear an irregular rhythm to the engine's idle. "Thank you, but I need to reach Veracruz by morning," he said, caution winning out over courtesy. "I'll be fine." The woman nodded, seeming unsurprised by his refusal. "Then I'll wait with you until the light changes. No one should be alone at this crossing." Against his better judgment, Alejandro found himself intrigued. Perhaps she was just a kind old woman, somewhat eccentric but harmless. Or perhaps she knew something about this strange traffic light that could explain its presence here. "Has it been red for long?" he asked. "It's always red at first," she replied cryptically. "It turns green when it's time." "Time for what?" "To cross over." She turned to look at him directly now. "You're a skeptic, aren't you, Alejandro? You don't believe in the things that exist beyond what you can touch and count?" The sound of his name from this stranger's lips sent another jolt through him. "How do you know my name?" he demanded. She reached into her purse and pulled out an old newspaper yellowed with age and wrinkled from handling. She handed it through the window to him. "Because I've been waiting for you." Alejandro took the newspaper with trembling hands. The masthead read El Universal, one of Mexico's major papers. The date was today's date, but the year 1983. Almost 40 years ago. His eyes moved to the headline and froze. "Tragic accident on Route 150D, 5 deaths." Below was a blurry black and white photo of a crushed Honda Civic beside a large truck, and in the corner a small photo of a woman, the exact woman sitting in the car beside him. "This isn't possible," Alejandro whispered. "This paper is 40 years old." "Turn to page 2, the woman said softly. With dread building in his chest, Alejandro turned the page. There in the bottom corner was a small article titled, "Fatal Accident on Highway 150D." Below it was a photo of a crumpled Honda Civic under a fallen tree. And at the end of the article, a line that made his blood freeze. The victim was identified as Alejandro Vega, 28, who was traveling from Mexico City to Veracruz to visit his ailing father. Alejandro's hands were shaking so badly now that the newspaper rustled audibly. "This is my name. My car. How can this—" "You didn't stop at the red light, Alejandro," the woman repeated, her voice now filled with compassion. "You fell asleep at the wheel for just a second, long enough to miss the red light at the intersection, long enough not to see the truck coming, long enough for everything to end." "No," Alejandro shook his head vigorously. "I'm alive. I'm sitting here talking to you. I'm on my way to see my father." "I thought the same thing," the woman said. "After my accident, I was in such a hurry to get home. My son was waiting. He was only 5 years old. I didn't want to wait at a red light on an empty road in the middle of the night. Just this once, I thought. Who would know?" She gestured toward the newspaper. "But someone always knows. And now I collect those who, like me, made the same mistake. Those who didn't respect the boundary between worlds." Alejandro felt as if all oxygen had been sucked from the car. He looked around desperately, noticing for the first time that the rain wasn't hitting his windshield anymore, though he could still see it falling. The sound of the storm had faded to silence, and beyond the traffic light where the road should continue, there was now only a bright white glow. "No," he said again, though his denial had lost its conviction. "My father needs me." "I'm sorry," the woman said, genuine regret in her voice. "But it's too late for that journey. Look." She pointed to the traffic light, which had silently changed from red to green. "Now we can go," she said. "Not to Veracruz, not to your father, but to where all of us eventually must go." As she spoke, a blinding white light appeared ahead, growing in intensity until it was all Alejandro could see. In that moment of terrible clarity, memories flooded back his eyelids, growing heavy the momentary surrender to sleep, the jolt, as he awakened to see the truck bearing down on him too late to swerve the impact that seemed to last forever. "I never got to say goodbye," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Few of us do," the woman said gently. "That's the cruelest part." The light ahead grew stronger, and with it came a sense of peace that began to replace Alejandro's fear. But as his car slowly rolled forward toward the light, one last coherent thought formed in his mind. "Will I become like you now?" he asked, looking at the woman. "Waiting at this traffic light for others?" She nodded solemnly. "For a time, until you've helped enough souls across. Until you've earned your own crossing." "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. 40 years, she replied, "since my own accident. But I'm nearly done now. You're one of my last travelers." As they approached the light together, Alejandro thought of his father, waiting in a hospital bed, perhaps already sensing that his son would never arrive. He thought of all the words left unsaid between them, the reconciliation that would never come, at least not in this life. "Maybe I'll see him soon," Alejandro said, more to himself than to his companion. "Perhaps," she answered. "Time moves differently on the other side of the light." Their cars crossed the threshold together, the green traffic light fading behind them. And as they vanished into the brilliant whiteness, the light turned red once more, waiting for the next traveler who wouldn't stop, who wouldn't respect the boundary, who would need someone to guide them across when their time came too soon. Miles away in a hospital in Veracruz, Alejandro's father opened his eyes, suddenly emerging from his coma. "My son," he whispered to the startled nurse. "My son was just here. He said he forgives me." The nurse checked the time, 1:30 a.m., and made a note in the chart about possible hallucinations. She didn't know that at that exact moment on a rain-soaked mountain pass, workers were pulling a body from the wreckage of a Honda Civic that had collided with a tree after the driver fell asleep at the wheel. She couldn't know that in the years to come, travelers on that mountain road would occasionally report seeing a strange traffic light where no intersection existed, and beside it a young man in a Honda Civic patiently waiting to help lost souls find their way home. Some would say that if you looked closely, you could see tears on his face as he guided them across, tears not of sorrow, but of compassion for those who, like him, had one last lesson to learn about the boundaries between worlds and the patience required to cross them safely. And in the decades that followed, locals would add to the legend, saying that sometimes, very rarely, when a driver stopped at that phantom red light, even though logic told them no light should exist there, they would receive a second chance. The light would remain red much longer than normal, long enough for them to snap fully awake, to notice the truck approaching too fast around the bend ahead, to realize that had they continued, they would have met with tragedy. Those lucky few would drive away with a story few would believe, but with their lives intact. And they would never again run a red light, no matter how deserted the road, no matter how urgent their journey. For they understood, as Alejandro had learned too late, that some boundaries exist for a reason, and some warnings come from those who have paid the ultimate price for ignoring them. Whispers from the radio. "You know what they say about Sierra de San Pedro, don't you?" Manuel's weathered face crinkled with a knowing smile as he sipped his coffee, across from Salvador at the roadside diner. Outside, trucks roared past on the highway connecting Monterrey to Tijuana, their headlights briefly illuminating the darkness before vanishing into the night. Salvador Morales rolled his eyes, stirring sugar into his own coffee. At 35, with 15 years behind the wheel of long-haul trucks, he'd heard every superstition, legend, and ghost story the road had to offer. "Let me guess," Salvador said, leaning back in the vinyl booth. "Another ghost hitchhiker, or maybe the vanishing truck stop this time?" He chuckled, the sound of a man who dealt exclusively in diesel distance and deadlines, concrete things, not phantoms. Manuel's smile faded, replaced by a solemnity that didn't fit with his usually jovial demeanor. "This isn't a joke, my friend. I'm talking about the radio." Salvador paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. Something in the older man's tone gave him pause. Manuel wasn't one for dramatics, quite the opposite. In their decade of sharing routes and roadside meals, Salvador had come to respect Manuel's measured approach to everything. "What about the radio?" Salvador asked. Curiosity piqued despite his skepticism. Manuel glanced around the diner, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Last year, my friend Diego took that route. It was a night just like tonight, clear sky, full moon. When he reached Tijuana, he wasn't the same man anymore." "What happened to him?" He said the radio in his truck picked up a strange station when he drove through the mountains, a station he'd never heard before, and the voice on the radio. Manuel hesitated. The voice knew his name, knew about his family, knew his darkest secrets. Salvador's instinct was to laugh it off, but the haunted look in Manuel's eyes stopped him. Instead, he reached for a lighter approach. "Probably just fell asleep at the wheel for a second, started dreaming with his eyes open." "Diego quit driving after that night," Manuel continued as if Salvador hadn't spoken. "He said the voice on the radio, it wasn't human, and it asked him to do terrible things." Now Salvador did laugh, though it came out more nervous than dismissive. "You're trying to spook me because I'm taking the Sierra route tonight, aren't you?" Manuel shrugged, finishing his coffee. "Believe what you want. But if I were you, I wouldn't turn on the radio when driving through Sierra de San Pedro, especially not on a full moon night." Salvador paid for their meals and walked with Manuel to the parking lot. Their trucks sat side by side like sleeping giants. Salvador's newer Freightliner Cascadia dwarfing Manuel's older model. "Be careful out there," Manuel said, clasping Salvador's shoulder. "Some roads hide more than just bad weather and drunk drivers." "I'll be fine," Salvador assured him, climbing into his cab. "Been driving these routes since you were still using paper maps." But as he pulled onto the highway and watched Manuel's taillights disappear in the opposite direction, Salvador couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. He'd never been superstitious. His wife, Gabriela, handled all the religious duties in their family, from Sunday Mass to blessing their home against evil. Salvador dealt in the concrete world of highways, schedules, and load weights. Yet Manuel's warning lingered like an unwelcome passenger. The Sierra de San Pedro mountains loomed in the distance, their silhouette dark against the star-filled sky. Salvador had driven this route dozens of times before without incident. Tonight would be no different. To prove this to himself, Salvador deliberately reached for the radio dial as he began the ascent into the mountains. He scrolled through stations, finding mostly static as the terrain grew more rugged. Typical for remote areas, nothing supernatural about poor reception. Ridiculous, Salvador muttered to himself, letting old trucker tales get to me after all these years. The road wound higher into the mountains, the night clear and brilliant with moonlight. It illuminated the sheer drops that bordered the narrow pass, turning the landscape into a monochromatic tableau of silver and shadow. Salvador drove carefully but confidently, his headlights cutting through the darkness. 2 hours into the mountain passage, Salvador began to regret his earlier bravado. The isolation was more complete than he remembered, with not a single other vehicle seen for over an hour. The radio had devolved into pure static, adding an unsettling soundtrack to the increasingly claustrophobic journey through high rock walls and hairpin turns. Salvador reached to turn the radio off, then froze as the static suddenly cleared. Crystal clear audio emerged from the speakers, so pristine it was as if the broadcast originated from inside his cab. "Welcome to the night show," a smooth, warm male voice announced. "For those lonely travelers on empty roads, I'm Gabriel, your companion for tonight." Salvador relaxed. Just a normal radio station with unusually good reception in this dead zone. Nothing supernatural about that. Technology was always improving. "Tonight we're talking about secrets," the voice Gabriel continued, his tone intimate and soothing. "Those things we keep hidden in our hearts, the truths we don't dare to acknowledge even to ourselves. Do you have such secrets, Salvador?" Salvador's foot slipped off the accelerator, causing the truck to lurch momentarily. How had the announcer known his name? He must have misheard. "For those just joining us," Gabriel said, as if reading Salvador's thoughts, "I know you're wondering how I know your name. Don't worry, that's just one of the small miracles of this program. We know all of our listeners." A cold sensation spread through Salvador's chest. This couldn't be happening. He jabbed at the radio's power button, but nothing changed. Gabriel's voice continued uninterrupted. "Salvador?" Gabriel called his name again, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "I know about the letter you never sent to your mother, the one you wrote the night before she died." The truck swerved as Salvador's hands jerked on the wheel. No one knew about that letter. He had never told anyone about it, not his wife, not his closest friends. The night before his mother's unexpected death, he had written down all his regrets and confessions, things he had been too proud to say to her face. But he never delivered it. She passed away before he found the courage. "Who are you?" Salvador demanded aloud, knowing it was absurd to expect an answer from a radio broadcast. "I've told you, Salvador," Gabriel replied, as if they were having a normal conversation. "I'm Gabriel, host of the night show. But I also know about the accident in 2017, the one you never reported. The car you hit and fled from. The man you left there injured and afraid." Salvador's breathing became shallow and rapid. The accident had happened on a rainy night on a deserted road. There had been no witnesses, no cameras. He had been certain of it. He had checked the news for days afterward, terrified of seeing a report about an injured or dead pedestrian, but nothing ever appeared. Eventually, he convinced himself the man must have been only slightly hurt, able to find help on his own. "Turn it off," Salvador told himself, but his hands remained frozen on the wheel instead of moving toward the radio. Instead, he continued listening, mesmerized by the voice and the secrets it revealed. "Don't worry, Salvador," Gabriel's voice soothed. "I'm not here to judge you. We all have dark secrets. We all have moments of weakness, and that's why I'm here to listen, to understand, to help you unburden yourself of these secrets." The mountain road became more winding, and Salvador had to focus to keep the truck on the correct lane. But Gabriel's voice continued to draw his attention like a hypnotic spell he couldn't break. "Tell me, Salvador," Gabriel continued. "Tell me about your greatest secret, the one you don't dare admit even to yourself." "I don't know what you're talking about," Salvador muttered, though deep inside he knew exactly what Gabriel was referring to. "Don't lie to yourself, Salvador," Gabriel's voice hardened. "I'm talking about Maria. I'm talking about what happened that night 7 years ago when she said she was going to leave you." Salvador felt as if someone had punched him in the chest. Maria, his ex-wife. The woman he had loved deeply. The woman who he had... "Stop!" Salvador shouted, finally reaching for the radio to turn it off. But when his fingers touched the knob, a jolt of electricity shot through his hand, causing him to pull back in pain. "You can't run from the truth, Salvador!" Gabriel's voice now seemed to come from everywhere in the cabin, not just the speakers. "You can't run from what you did to Maria." "It was an accident," Salvador whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "I didn't mean to hurt her. We were arguing and I lost control." "But you didn't call for help, did you?" Gabriel accused. "You left her there, Salvador. You thought she was just unconscious, but she was bleeding internally, and you walked away." Salvador couldn't see the road anymore through his tears. He pulled the truck over to the shoulder, head falling forward onto the steering wheel. "How do you know these things?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Who are you?" "I told you already, Salvador," Gabriel replied, his voice now eerily sweet. "I'm Gabriel, host of The Night Show. I'm here to listen to your secrets to help you unburden yourself." "You're not real," Salvador said, trying to steady himself. "You're just a voice on the radio? Or maybe I've fallen asleep and I'm dreaming?" Gabriel laughed, a deep resonant sound that made the air in the cabin seem to vibrate. "I'm very real, Salvador. More real than many things you believe to be real, and I can prove it." The radio emitted a piercing screech that forced Salvador to cover his ears. When the noise stopped, Gabriel's voice returned, but now it sounded closer. "Look in your rearview mirror, Salvador," Gabriel commanded. Despite every instinct warning him not to, Salvador raised his head and looked at the mirror, and his heart nearly stopped. In the back seat of the cabin, where moments before there had been nothing but shadows, sat a man, or at least something that resembled a man. He wore a black suit, unnaturally crisp and unwrinkled. His face had the appearance of a mask made from smoke and shadow, with eyes that glowed from within. When Salvador looked into those eyes, he felt as if he were falling into an endless abyss. "Hello, Salvador," Gabriel said, his mouth moving in perfect sync with the voice still coming from the radio. "It's nice to finally meet you in person." Salvador tried to open the truck door, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled frantically at the handle, but to no avail. "Don't be afraid," Gabriel said, his smile unnaturally wide, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. "I mean you no harm. I only want to help you, Salvador. Help you release the burden of those secrets." "What do you want from me?" Salvador asked, trembling. "I want you to confess," Gabriel said, leaning forward, his black eyes seeming to consume all light around them. "I want you to speak the truth about what you've done, about Maria, about the man in the accident, about all the sins you've kept hidden in your heart." "And if I do that, then what?" Salvador asked, trying to maintain some semblance of control despite his terror. "Then you will be released," Gabriel said, his voice now honey-sweet. "No more secrets, no more guilt, no more regret, just one honest confession and all will be forgiven." Something in Gabriel's words made Salvador want to believe. For 7 years he had lived in fear and regret, never speaking to anyone about what had happened that night with Maria, about how he had pushed her during their argument, how she had fallen and hit her head on the corner of a table, about how he had fled believing she was merely unconscious, about how he had planned to return after calming down, but by the time he did, it was too late. "Confess, Salvador," Gabriel whispered, his voice now seeming to come from inside Salvador's head. "Let me help you unburden yourself. I killed Maria," Salvador whispered, feeling as if a heavy stone had been lifted from his chest. "Not on purpose, but I did it. And I didn't help the man in the accident. I ran away both times. I was a coward." "Very good, Salvador," Gabriel said, his smile growing wider, his eyes briefly flashing with a red light. "That's a start. But there's more, isn't there? More secrets you've kept buried." And suddenly Salvador understood. This wasn't about release or forgiveness. This was about extraction, mining his pain and guilt, harvesting it for some purpose he couldn't comprehend. With each confession, he could feel something being pulled from him, as if parts of his essence were being siphoned away. "You're not a radio host," Salvador said, a new understanding dawning. "You're not even human. What are you?" Gabriel's smile remained, but his expression shifted to something more calculating. "I have many names, Salvador. On this road on full moon nights, I am the listener. I listen to the secrets that humans dare not tell one another, and in return, I take a small piece of them." "What piece?" Salvador asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "The most important part," Gabriel said, his black eyes now seeming to fill Salvador's entire field of vision. "The part your religions call the soul, a small fragment of it for each secret revealed." Salvador felt cold, bone deep. Not the cold of weather, but an internal chill, as if something had been drawn out of him. He now understood what Manuel had meant about Diego not being the same after his encounter. Diego had lost something essential, something that couldn't be replaced. "And now," Gabriel continued, "I'll take the rest." He extended his hand, which was no longer a human hand, but a construct of smoke and shadow in the shape of fingers. Salvador felt an invisible force pulling him toward Gabriel, as if his very essence was being drawn out. He tried to resist, but his body no longer obeyed his will. In that moment of desperation, Salvador remembered something, the small silver crucifix his mother had given him, which he still wore around his neck despite having stopped attending church years ago. He reached for it with trembling hands, pulled it from beneath his shirt and held it up. "In the name of God!" Salvador shouted, not sure if the words meant anything or if they were just instinct, a memory from childhood of stories his mother had told. Gabriel hissed a sound unlike anything Salvador had ever heard, a high-pitched screech like metal scraping against glass. He recoiled, his black eyes now blazing with pure anger. "You think a small symbol can save you?" Gabriel roared, his voice now distorted, as if many voices were speaking at once. "You think your weak faith can stand against me?" But Salvador had seen Gabriel's reaction, and he knew whatever the reason, the crucifix was causing him pain. He continued to hold it toward Gabriel, and at the same time remembered the prayers his mother had taught him as a child. "Our Father who art in heaven," Salvador began, his voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. "Hallowed be thy name." Gabriel screamed, the sound making the truck's windows vibrate. The radio began to emit chaotic static, and the lights in the cabin flickered wildly. "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." Salvador continued, heedless of the noise and light. "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." As he spoke the final words, there was a loud explosion from the radio, and suddenly Gabriel was gone, not gradually fading away, but vanishing completely in an instant, as if he had never been there. The radio went silent, the cabin lights returned to normal, and the truck door unlocked with a soft click. Salvador sat there, breathing heavily, sweat cooling on his skin. He wasn't sure if what had just happened was real, or if he had experienced some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue and loneliness on a dark mountain road. But the crucifix in his hand was still hot to the touch, as if it had just been pulled from a fire. He decided not to continue driving that night. He reclined his seat and decided to sleep until morning, when sunlight would chase away the darkness and the strange occurrences of the night. When dawn came, Salvador woke with a sense of relief. In the light of day, the events of the previous night seemed less real, almost like a dream. He turned on the radio, half expecting to hear Gabriel's voice. But there was only normal music and morning talk shows. Just exhaustion, he told himself. That's all it was. But as he continued his journey, the memory of the encounter wouldn't leave him. The way Gabriel had known his deepest secrets, the things no one else could possibly know. The sensation of something being drawn out of him with each confession. The relief he had felt afterward, despite the terror. When he arrived in Tijuana, Salvador made a decision that would change the course of his life. He called the police and reported the hit-and-run accident from years before. He confessed his role in Maria's death, admitting that he had left the scene instead of calling for help. He knew he might face prison time, but for the first time in many years, he felt a genuine peace. 3 months later, after receiving a suspended sentence and mandatory counseling sessions, Salvador happened to run into Manuel at the same diner where they had spoken before. "I heard about what happened," Manuel said, looking at Salvador with understanding eyes. "About the case and everything. You did the right thing, Salvador." "But you were right about Sierra de San Pedro," Salvador admitted. "About the radio and the host." Manuel nodded gravely. "Gabriel. That's the name he always uses." "What is he?" Salvador asked, finally daring to ask the question that had haunted him for months. "The locals call him El Coleccionista de Secretos, the collector of secrets," Manuel explained, lowering his voice. "They say that long ago he was a priest, one who heard confessions in the church, but he began using those secrets to manipulate people to gain power. And when he died, he could not go to heaven or hell. He was trapped here, still collecting secrets, but now to feed himself." "But the crucifix stopped him," Salvador said. "He is still a priest, albeit a fallen one." Manuel nodded. "The symbols of faith still have power over him. But what truly saved you, Salvador, was the truth. When you voluntarily confessed your sins, not because you were forced, but because you wanted redemption, that is something Gabriel could not fight against." Salvador thought about this. "Will he come back for me?" "Perhaps," Manuel said with a serious expression. "But not soon. Not until you have accumulated more secrets worthy of his collection." As Salvador drove back to Monterrey, he thought about all that had happened. About his confession to the police, to Maria's family, to himself. And although the road ahead was difficult with legal consequences, and the burden of facing those he had wronged, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Occasionally, on dark nights when he was driving remote routes, Salvador would hear static on the radio, and for a moment he would tense, expecting Gabriel's voice to emerge. Sometimes he would catch a glimpse of a black truck in his rearview mirror, its headlights flashing as if sending a message. But Salvador wore his mother's crucifix always now, and more importantly, he carried fewer secrets. He had learned that the darkest thing about secrets wasn't just keeping them, it was believing you had to bear them alone. Sometimes, on his routes through small towns, Salvador would stop at local churches. Not to pray in the formal sense, he still wasn't sure what he believed, but to light a candle for Maria, for the man he had injured in the accident, and strangely for Gabriel as well. For he understood now that Gabriel, whatever he was trapped in his own way, forced to feed on the pain and guilt of others, unable to find his own redemption. And on full moon nights, when Salvador drove through mountain passes like Sierra de San Pedro, he would turn off his radio completely. But he would speak aloud in his cab, not in fear, but in defiance. "I have no more secrets for you, Gabriel. Find someone else to feed upon." Whether Gabriel heard him or not, Salvador couldn't say. But he drove on through the night, no longer afraid of the darkness within, or without knowing that the most powerful weapon against those who would harvest our souls is not to hide our sins, but to face them, to bring them into the light where they lose their power over us and over those who would use them against us. And if, as Manuel suggested, Gabriel was indeed still out there on those mountain roads of Sierra de San Pedro, waiting for lonely drivers desperate enough to turn on their radios for company, Salvador hoped they would find the strength he had found. The strength not to run from their pasts, but to confront them. For in that confrontation lies not just personal redemption, but protection from those entities that thrive in the shadows of human regret, feeding on the secrets we dare not speak aloud. Because in the end, the most frightening thing about Gabriel wasn't his supernatural abilities or his hunger for souls. It was how he reflected the darkness that already existed within Salvador himself. And in confronting that darkness, Salvador had found a light that no shadow creature, no matter how ancient or powerful, could ever extinguish. Dust and shadows. Miguel Rivera pulled his rental car to the side of the deserted highway and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the occasional ping of the cooling metal and the soft whisper of the wind through the nearby scrub brush. 10 miles outside Santa Cecilia, on this forgotten stretch of Mexican highway, he finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he was doing. 10 years, he murmured, running a hand through his dark hair. 10 years without setting foot in that town. At 32, Miguel had built a respectable life for himself in Mexico City. His architecture firm had grown from a struggling two-person operation to a sought-after boutique studio with high-profile clients. He had a modern apartment and Condesa colleagues who respected him, casual friends who enjoyed his company. From the outside, his life looked like success. But none of it had filled the hollow space that Santa Cecilia had left in him when he fled a decade ago, leaving behind not just his family and childhood home, but also the ghost of Rosalinda Vega, the only woman he had ever truly loved. The text message had come 3 days ago, jolting him from sleep at 2 a.m. Abuela Cruz passed away yesterday. Funeral on November 2nd. She would want you there. Mama. His grandmother's death wasn't unexpected at 86. She had lived a full life, but the timing felt cruelly significant. November 2nd. Dia de los Muertos. The Day of the Dead. Of course it would be today, Miguel said to the empty car. The one day of the year when the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead was said to be at its thinnest. The day when souls could return to visit their loved ones. He hadn't believed in such things since childhood. The rational, educated architect in him dismissed them as superstition. But as he sat on this lonely stretch of road with the sun setting over the hills where Rosalinda had died, he couldn't help but feel a creeping unease. His phone vibrated. A message from Diego, his business partner, made it to Santa Cecilia. Yet remember, you promised to be back by Monday. We have the Gonzalez presentation. Miguel typed a quick reply, still on the road. We'll be there soon, then tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. Diego had tried to convince him to fly, but Miguel had insisted on driving. He needed the time alone, the gradual transition from his current life to the past he'd abandoned. Or perhaps he was simply delaying the inevitable confrontation with the ghosts he'd left behind, both literal and figurative. With a deep breath, he restarted the engine and pulled back onto the highway. The sun had nearly disappeared now, painting the sky in dramatic strokes of orange and purple. In the distance, the lights of Santa Cecilia were beginning to twinkle against the darkening landscape. As he drove, Miguel couldn't help but remember the last time he'd traveled this road in the opposite direction, fleeing in the pre-dawn hours after Rosalinda's funeral. He had been 22, then shattered by grief and guilt, unable to bear the accusing glances of her family, the whispers that followed him through town. It was his motorcycle. He should never have let her ride it. He knew she didn't have the experience. The night of the accident had been much like this one, clear with a full moon illuminating the winding mountain roads. They had argued that night. Miguel had received an offer from a prestigious architecture firm in Mexico City, a dream opportunity. But it meant leaving Santa Cecilia. Come with me, he had pleaded. We can start a life together in the city. But Rosa had refused. Her father was ill and she couldn't leave her family. You're choosing your career over us, she had accused. Over me. The argument had escalated until Rosa, furious, had grabbed the keys to Miguel's motorcycle, a powerful machine he had saved for months to buy, and stormed out. By the time he realized what she intended to do, she was already speeding away into the night. He had taken his car to follow her, but it was too late. On a curve of this very road, the infamous Loma de los Suspiros, or Hill of Sighs Rosa, had lost control. The motorcycle had gone over the edge down the steep embankment. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Miguel slowed as he approached that very curve. 10 years had passed, but someone still maintained the small memorial cross at the roadside. Fresh flowers had been placed there recently, marigolds, the traditional flower of Dia de los Muertos. Rosa's father must have visited earlier. He considered stopping, but decided against it. Better to face her family first, to pay his respects to his grandmother. There would be time to visit Rosa's memorial later. As Miguel rounded the curve, his headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside, a young woman with long, dark hair wearing a simple white dress. She was waving, clearly seeking a ride. Miguel's first instinct was caution. Picking up hitchhikers, especially at night on deserted roads, wasn't wise, but something about the woman's posture, a certain vulnerability, made him slow the car. As he pulled alongside her, his heart nearly stopped. The woman's face, illuminated by his headlights, was hauntingly familiar. It couldn't be, and yet— Rosa, he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. The woman leaned down to look through the passenger window, and Miguel felt the world tilt beneath him. It was Rosalinda, exactly as she had looked 10 years ago. Her dark eyes bright with intelligence, her full lips curved in that slightly crooked smile he had loved so dearly. "Miguel," she said, her voice sending a shiver through him. "I've been waiting for you." Miguel's rational mind scrambled for explanations. A look-alike, a hallucination brought on by guilt and exhaustion, a cruel prank. But deep down he knew it was none of these things. "You can't be real," he managed to say, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. "I'm as real as you need me to be," she replied, her voice carrying an ethereal quality like an echo from a vast, empty space. "Will you give me a ride home?" Miguel's hand moved of its own accord, unlocking the passenger door. Rosa slid into the seat beside him, bringing with her a subtle scent of marigolds and earth. As she settled in, the temperature in the car dropped noticeably despite the mild evening. "This isn't possible," Miguel said, staring at her profile. In the dashboard lights, her skin had an unnatural pallor, almost translucent. "Rosa, you died," she finished, turning to face him with a sad smile. "Yes, 10 years ago today." "Then how?" "It's Dia de los Muertos, Miguel," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "The day when the dead can return to visit those they left behind. And I've been waiting for you to come back." Miguel's mind reeled. His grandmother had told him stories about Dia de los Muertos since childhood, about how the spirits of the deceased returned to the world of the living for one night. But he had never truly believed it. They were just stories, myths meant to comfort those left behind, to keep cultural traditions alive. Yet here was Rosa sitting beside him, looking exactly as she had the night she died. The rational architect in him insisted this couldn't be happening, while another part, the part raised on his grandmother's stories, accepted it with a strange calm. "Where should I take you?" he asked, putting the car in drive and continuing toward town, acting on instinct rather than reason. "Not to town yet," Rosa said. "I want to show you something first. Take the next right." Miguel followed her directions, turning onto a smaller road that wound higher into the hills. They drove in silence for several minutes, Miguel stealing glances at his passenger, afraid she might vanish if he looked away too long. "You never came back," Rosa finally said, her tone not accusatory but sad. "I couldn't," Miguel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "After what happened, after you, everyone blamed me. Your father, your brothers, even my own mother said I should never have let you ride that motorcycle." "And you blamed yourself most of all," Rosa observed. Miguel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "That's why I'm here tonight," she said softly. "Not to blame you, but to free you from that blame, to help you understand." They crested a hill, and Rosa directed him to pull over at a lookout point. Below them, the lights of Santa Cecilia twinkled like earthbound stars. The full moon bathed the landscape in silver light, making the town look like something from another time, another world. "Do you remember this spot?" Rosa asked. Miguel nodded. "Our special place. We used to come here to watch the sunset." "And to make plans," Rosa added. "All those dreams we had." "I dreamed of becoming a great architect," Miguel said. "And you?" "I dreamed of us," Rosa finished, "of building a life together here in Santa Cecilia." Miguel felt tears threatening. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have respected what you wanted. I shouldn't have pushed so hard for you to leave with me." Rosa shook her head, her dark hair moving like silk in the moonlight. "And I should have understood your dreams better. We were both young, both stubborn. I should never have let you take the motorcycle that night." "You didn't let me, Miguel," Rosa said firmly. "I took it. It was my choice, my mistake. I was angry and reckless. But if I had stopped you—" "You couldn't have," she interrupted. "Just as no one could have stopped you from leaving Santa Cecilia afterward. We all make our choices, and we all live or die with the consequences." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words settling between them. From the town below, Miguel could hear faint music. Celebrations for Dia de los Muertos were beginning. "There's something I need to show you," Rosa said suddenly, turning to face him fully. "Something I need you to understand." She reached out her fingers, cool as they brushed against his cheek. The world seemed to shift around them, reality rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Suddenly Miguel was no longer in the car, but standing on the roadside at Loma de los Suspiros, watching a scene unfold before him. He saw Rosa on his motorcycle, tears streaming down her face as she raced through the night. He saw the deer that suddenly bounded across the road, startling her. He saw her swerve, lose control, and plummet over the edge. "No!" he cried out, trying to move toward her to prevent what he knew was coming, but he was frozen in place, a helpless observer. Then the scene shifted again. He was at Rosa's funeral, but instead of seeing it from his own perspective, he was watching himself, young, devastated, isolated from the mourners who blamed him for the tragedy. "They were wrong to blame you," Rosa's voice said beside him. "My father, my brothers, they were blinded by grief, but they've changed, Miguel. Time has softened their hearts." The scene before them changed again. Now he was seeing Rosa's father, older, placing flowers at her memorial cross. "I understand now, Rosa," the old man was saying. "Miguel was not to blame. You were both so young, so headstrong, just like I was at your age. I've carried this anger for too long. I hope wherever you are, you can forgive me for driving him away." The visions faded, and Miguel found himself back in the car, tears streaming down his face. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked. "Because it's time for you to come home," Rosa said gently. "Not just to bury your grandmother, but to reconcile with the past, to forgive yourself as others have forgiven you." "I've built a life in Mexico City," Miguel protested weakly. "My work, my firm." "A life, yes," Rosa agreed. "But not a full one. You've been running for 10 years, Miguel, always looking back over your shoulder, never allowing yourself to form deep connections to love again." She was right, and Miguel knew it. Despite his professional success, his personal life had remained in stasis since leaving Santa Cecilia. He had casual relationships, but never allowed anyone close enough to hurt him or to be hurt by him again. "What about you?" he asked. Is this goodbye once and for all?" Rosa smiled, a gentle, luminous expression that made her seem more otherworldly than ever. "I've been watching over you, Miguel, all these years, but I can't move on until you do, until you stop living in the shadow of what happened." "I don't know if I can," Miguel admitted. "I don't know how to let you go." "Then let me help you," Rosa said. "There's one more place we need to visit tonight." She directed him back to the main road, then along a series of turns that Miguel recognized were leading them toward the local cemetery. When they arrived, the graveyard was alive with light and color. Hundreds of candles illuminated elaborate ofrendas altars decorated with marigolds, sugar skulls, and photographs of the deceased. Families sat together sharing meals and stories, celebrating the return of their loved ones on this special night. "My family will be at my grave," Rosa said. "I want you to speak with them." Fear gripped Miguel. "I can't. After all this time, what would I say?" "The truth," Rosa answered simply. "That you loved me, that you're sorry, that you've carried this burden for too long." "Will they see you too?" Miguel asked. Rosa shook her head. "Not as you do. Tonight is special for us, Miguel. A chance to heal what was broken, but you must take the first step." They left the car and walked into the cemetery. Miguel noticed that Rosa seemed to shimmer slightly in the moonlight, as if she wasn't quite solid. No one else seemed to see her as they passed by families gathered at graves, though several people nodded respectfully to Miguel, a few with looks of surprise at seeing him back in town. Near the center of the cemetery, Miguel spotted Rosa's family. Her elderly father, her mother, and two of her brothers gathered around a grave decorated with candles and her photograph. His steps faltered. "They won't reject you," Rosa assured him. "Trust me." Gathering his courage, Miguel approached the grave. Rosa's father, Señor Vega, was the first to notice him. The old man's eyes widened, then softened with recognition. "Miguel," he said, his voice roughened by age, "you've come back." "For my grandmother's funeral," Miguel explained awkwardly, "and to pay my respects to Rosa." He expected recrimination, coldness at the very least. Instead, Señor Vega stepped forward, and after a moment's hesitation embraced him. The old man's body felt frail in Miguel's arms, diminished from the intimidating figure of his youth. "It's been too long, my boy," Señor Vega said, stepping back to look at him. "Too many years wasted in anger and regret." Rosa's mother came forward next, tears in her eyes as she took Miguel's hands. "We heard about your grandmother. We're so sorry, Miguel. She was a wonderful woman." The genuine warmth of their welcome broke something inside Miguel. "I should have come back sooner," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I was afraid. I thought you all hated me for what happened to Rosa." "We did for a time," one of Rosa's brothers, Javier, acknowledged. "Grief makes people cruel. But as the years passed, we came to understand that what happened was a tragic accident. No one was truly to blame." Miguel looked past them to Rosa's grave. The photograph showed her as she had been in life, vibrant, smiling, full of promise. Beside the photo lay a silver heart pendant on a chain, the same necklace he had given her for her 18th birthday, the one she had been wearing the night she died. "Her necklace," Miguel said, surprised. "You put it on her ofrenda." "My father found it at the accident site," Senor Vega explained. "We've kept it all these years, but I think Rosa would want you to have it now." He lifted the necklace and held it out to Miguel. As Miguel reached for it, he caught sight of Rosa standing behind her family, watching the scene with tears shimmering in her eyes. She nodded encouragingly. "Thank you," Miguel said, accepting the necklace with trembling hands. "This means more than you can know." They spoke for a while longer, sharing memories of Rosa, catching up on the events of the past decade. The conversation was tinged with sadness, but also with a sense of healing, of old wounds finally beginning to close. When Miguel finally excused himself to visit his grandmother's grave, Rosa walked beside him, unseen by the others. "Do you understand now?" she asked. "They've forgiven you. It's time you forgave yourself." "I'm trying," Miguel said. "Being here, seeing them again, it helps. But I still miss you, Rosa." "I still wonder what might have been." "Some questions don't have answers," Rosa replied. "Some paths remain untaken, but that doesn't mean we can't find peace with the path we're on." They reached his grandmother's grave, freshly dug and decorated with candles and flowers. His mother and other relatives had already been there, leaving offerings on a small altar. "She loved you very much," Rosa said. "She understood why you stayed away, but she always hoped you'd come home someday." Miguel knelt by the grave, placing his hand on the fresh earth. "I'm sorry I wasn't here at the end, Abuela," he whispered, "but I'm here now." As he spoke, he felt a gentle breeze stir the air around him, carrying the scent of his grandmother's favorite flowers. For a moment he could almost sense her presence too, alongside Rosa's, the two women who had shaped his life in such profound ways, both now beyond his reach, but somehow still with him. When Miguel stood, he noticed that Rosa seemed less substantial than before, her outline blurring slightly at the edges. "You're fading," he said, alarmed. "My time is almost up," she confirmed. "The night is waning. Soon I must return to the other side." Panic seized him. "No, not yet. There's still so much I want to say, to ask you." "We've said what needed saying," Rosa interrupted gently. "You've made peace with my family. You've begun to make peace with yourself. That was the purpose of my return." "Will I see you again?" Miguel asked, dreading the answer. "One day," Rosa promised. "But not soon, Miguel. I want you to live truly live. Love again, laugh again, experience all that life has to offer. That's the only way to honor what we had." "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "You can," she insisted. "You're stronger than you know, and you won't be alone. I'll be watching over you just as I always have been." She stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face. Her hand felt like the barest whisper against his skin. "Take the pendant," she said. "Keep it not as a reminder of guilt, but as a token of love, of what was and what still is in a different way." Miguel clutched the silver heart in his palm, feeling its solid reality as Rosa herself grew increasingly insubstantial. "I love you, Rosa," he said, his voice breaking. "I always will." "And I love you, Miguel," she replied, her voice now distant like an echo from across a vast space. "That's why I want you to be free." With those words, she began to dissolve into the night air like mist under the morning sun. "Leave, Miguel," her voice whispered as she faded completely. "And remember that I am always in your heart." And then she was gone, leaving Miguel alone among the gravestones, the silver pendant warm in his palm like a promise. The following morning, Miguel woke in his childhood bedroom in his mother's house, momentarily disoriented. Had last night been a dream? The encounter with Rosa felt too vivid, too real to have been mere imagination, yet in the clear light of day his rational mind struggled to accept what had happened. Then his fingers closed around the silver heart pendant on the bedside table, and he knew whatever had happened, whether a genuine supernatural encounter or some profound psychological experience, it had changed something fundamental within him. His mother was in the kitchen when he came downstairs preparing breakfast, as if the decade of his absence had never happened. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, setting a cup of coffee before him. "Yes," Miguel replied, surprising himself with the truth of it. He had slept better than he had in years, without the nightmares that had periodically haunted him since Rosa's death. "You seemed different when you came home last night," his mother observed carefully. "More at peace." Miguel fingered the pendant in his pocket. "I spoke with Rosa's family at the cemetery," he said. "They were kind." His mother nodded, unsurprised. "People change, mijo. Time softens even the hardest hearts. Senor Vega has asked about you often over the years." "Why didn't you tell me?" She gave him a knowing look. "Would you have believed me? Would you have come back?" He couldn't argue with that. Until last night he might not have been ready to hear it, let alone act on it. After breakfast, Miguel found himself drawn back to Loma de los Suspiros, to the site of the accident that had altered the course of his life. The memorial cross stood as it had the night before, adorned with marigolds that glowed golden in the morning sunlight. Miguel knelt beside it, running his fingers over Rosa's name carved into the wood. He took the silver pendant from his pocket and looked at it one last time before hanging it carefully on the cross. "I won't forget you," he promised aloud. "But I won't live in the shadow of that night anymore either. I'll try to live the way you wanted me to, fully, with my whole heart." As he spoke, a warm breeze stirred the marigold petals, sending them swirling into the air around him. One landed on his hand, its touch as light as a kiss. Miguel smiled, tucking the memory of last night, of Rosa's forgiveness, of her love that transcended death itself, into the deepest part of his heart. Then he brushed the dirt from his knees, and turned toward Santa Cecilia. It was time to stop running, time to come home. In the days that followed, Miguel called Diego to explain that he would be staying in Santa Cecilia longer than planned. "There are some things I need to resolve here," he said. "Family matters." "Take the time you need," Diego replied, surprising Miguel with his understanding. "The Gonzalez project can wait." Miguel spent those days reconnecting with his hometown, with his family, with Rosa's family. He visited his grandmother's grave daily, sometimes speaking aloud to her as if she could hear him. Perhaps after his experience with Rosa, he believed she could. He also began sketching again, not formal architectural drawings, but the kind of passionate, creative work that had first drawn him to the profession. Designs for a community center in Santa Cecilia, plans for restoring some of the town's historic buildings, dreams given form on paper. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his mother's house working on these sketches, Senor Vega came to visit. The old man eased himself into the chair beside Miguel, glancing with interest at the drawings. "You still have talent," he observed. "Rosa always said you would design beautiful buildings someday." "I've designed some," Miguel admitted, "but nothing as meaningful as these could be." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors no architect could fully capture. "I saw her, you know," Miguel finally said, the words emerging before he could reconsider them. "On Dia de los Muertos, I saw Rosa." Instead of the skepticism he expected, Senor Vega nodded thoughtfully. "I believe you," he said simply. "Each year on that night I feel her presence at her grave. Not just a memory or a feeling, but her as real as you or me." "She told me you had forgiven me," Miguel said, "that it was time I forgave myself." "She was always wise beyond her years," the old man replied, his eyes misting slightly. "And she was right." "I'm thinking of staying," Miguel said, the decision crystallizing as he spoke it aloud. "Not permanently, perhaps, but dividing my time, opening a second office of my firm here." Senor Vega smiled. "Santa Cecilia could use an architect with vision. Too many of our young people leave never to return." "I was one of them," Miguel acknowledged. "But you came back," Senor Vega pointed out. "Sometimes the longest journey is the one that brings us home." As darkness fell, Miguel thought he saw a flicker of movement in the garden, a flash of white, like a dress, a hint of dark hair in the shadows. But when he looked directly, there was nothing there. Just the night breeze stirring the flowers his mother had planted, carrying their scent to him like a benediction. Whether Rosa still watched over him, whether she visited on other nights besides Dia de los Muertos, Miguel couldn't say for certain. But he carried the memory of their final encounter with him, always a touchstone to return to in moments of doubt or darkness. And in time, as the months turned to years, Miguel did what she had asked of him. He lived, he laughed. Eventually he even loved again, though never in quite the same way. The silver heart pendant remained on Rosa's memorial cross, but she remained in his heart a cherished part of who he had been and who he became. Sometimes, driving the road to Mexico City for business, he would pass Loma de los Suspiros and feel a peculiar stillness in the air, as if time itself paused in that spot. And in those moments he would smile and whisper, "I'm living, Rosa. I'm trying." And though he could never be certain, sometimes he thought he heard a whisper in return, carried on the dust and shadows of the mountain road, "I know, Miguel, I've never left you, not really." For that was the truth that Dia de los Muertos celebrated, not that the dead return for just one night, but that they never truly leave us at all. They remain in our memories, in our hearts, in the people we become because we love them. And in that way they achieve a kind of immortality that no grave can contain, no boundary, not even between worlds, can limit. Miguel had learned this truth on a moonlit night with a ghost who wasn't really a ghost, but a manifestation of love that transcended death itself. And in that knowledge he found not just peace, but the courage to embrace life again, dust and shadows and all. The eternal passenger, Andrea Vasquez, had been warned about Highway 57. "No one takes that route at night anymore," her editor Ramirez had told her when she outlined her plan to investigate the mysterious disappearances, especially not alone. But Andrea hadn't built her reputation as one of El Universal's top investigative reporters by playing it safe. At 27, she'd already exposed 2 major corruption scandals and 1 human trafficking ring, earning both industry awards and death threats in the process. A string of unexplained disappearances on a remote highway. That was exactly the kind of story that made her journalistic instincts tingle. 12 people in 3 years, she said, spreading crime scene photos across Ramirez's desk. All vanished between San Juan del Rio and Mexico City. No bodies found, no ransom demands. Some of their vehicles were discovered abandoned on the roadside, engines still running. Others disappeared completely. Ramirez sighed, knowing that determined look in her eyes. "The police think it's a cartel thing, or maybe a serial killer." "Then why haven't they found a single body?" Andrea countered. "Why no evidence of violence? Why no patterns connecting the victims, except that they were all traveling alone at night?" "What's your theory?" Andrea hesitated. "I don't have one yet. That's why I need to drive the route myself. Talk to the families, the local police, see the locations where the vehicles were found." "Take Miguel with you," Ramirez insisted, referring to the photographer who often accompanied Andrea on assignments. "At least you'll have someone watching your back." Andrea had agreed to this compromise. But when Miguel called in sick with a high fever the day of their planned departure, she faced a decision: postpone the investigation or go alone. She chose the latter. San Juan del Rio was a 5-hour drive from Mexico City, a journey Andrea completed by early evening. She checked into a modest hotel near the town center and spent the remaining daylight hours interviewing family members of the missing persons. Their stories shared haunting similarities. Loved ones embarking on routine journeys, promising to call upon reaching their destinations, then vanishing without a trace. "My husband was a careful man," explained Carmen Diaz, whose spouse had disappeared 6 months earlier. "He'd made that drive 100 times. The police suggested he might have picked up a dangerous hitchhiker, but Rafael would never stop for strangers. Not at night, not on that road." "Did he mention anything unusual during his last call to you?" Andrea asked, notebook open on her lap. Carmen hesitated. "He said something about strange lights in his rearview mirror. I told him it was probably just another driver with their high beams on." But the way he described it, like the lights were changing colors, moving in ways that didn't make sense for a vehicle. Andrea made a note. Other families hadn't mentioned lights, but several had reported their missing relatives complaining about radio interference, static strange broadcasts, voices that seemed to speak directly to them shortly before disappearing. By the time Andrea finished her last interview, night had fallen. She stopped at a local bar, hoping to gather more information from residents who might be more forthcoming after a drink or two. The establishment was sparsely populated, just a few locals, and the elderly bartender who eyed her curiously as she ordered a mineral water. "You're that reporter from Mexico City," he said. It wasn't a question. "The one asking about the disappearances on Highway 57. Andrea nodded, not surprised that word had gotten around in a town this size. "Have you heard anything that might help me understand what's happening out there?" The bartender glanced around to ensure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "People around here don't like to talk about it, especially to outsiders. But there's a story, a legend about that stretch of road." Andrea tried not to look too eager. Local superstitions weren't usually her focus, but they sometimes contained kernels of truth that could lead to more concrete explanations. "I'm listening," she encouraged. "They call him El Transportista, the transporter," the bartender said in a lowered voice. "The story goes that about 20 years ago there was a truck driver named Javier who worked the route between Mexico City and San Juan del Rio. One night he stopped to help what looked like a woman in distress by the roadside. But it wasn't a woman at all. It was La Llorona, the weeping woman." Andrea suppressed a smile. La Llorona was one of Mexico's most famous ghost stories, a spectral woman said to wander waterways mourning her drowned children. "La Llorona doesn't usually haunt highways," she noted. The bartender nodded gravely. This was something different, something that took her form but wasn't her. When Javier approached, it dragged him into the darkness between worlds. "And now he haunts the highway," Andrea guessed, playing along. "He's trapped between life and death, forced to drive that route for eternity. And to free himself, he must collect souls, other drivers, travelers returning home after long journeys, just as he was doing when he was taken." The bartender's story was dramatic but not particularly helpful. Andrea thanked him anyway, paid for her drink, and returned to her hotel to review her notes and prepare for the next day's investigation. Her original plan had been to drive back to Mexico City in the morning, stopping at the locations where vehicles had been found abandoned. But something about the interviews nagged at her. The mentions of strange lights, radio interference, the eerie similarity of the circumstances surrounding each disappearance. Most had occurred between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. in areas with poor cell phone coverage on moonless nights. Tonight was not moonless. In fact, the full moon hung heavy and bright outside her hotel window, but something compelled her to reconsider her timeline. What if she drove the route now, during the hours when most disappearances had occurred? She wouldn't stop for anyone, of course, and her editor knew her location. It would be a calculated risk, but it might give her insights impossible to gain in daylight. Her decision made, Andrea was gathering her belongings when her phone rang an unknown number. "Andrea Vasquez?" a woman's voice asked when she answered. "Speaking," Andrea confirmed. "My name is Carmen Diaz," the woman said urgently. "I heard from a friend that you're investigating the disappearances on Highway 57. Andrea frowned. She had already interviewed Carmen Diaz that afternoon. This voice was different, younger, more agitated. "Yes, I'm working on a story about the missing persons," Andrea said cautiously. "My husband Ricardo was one of them," Carmen continued. "He vanished 6 months ago on his way back from Querétaro. The police found nothing, but I have information I haven't shared with them, information they would dismiss as crazy." Andrea's journalistic instincts sharpened. "What kind of information?" "I can't explain over the phone," Carmen replied. "But I'm in San Juan del Rio tonight. Could we meet? I have something you need to see." Andrea hesitated. Meeting an unknown source at night wasn't ideal, but this could be the break her investigation needed. "Where would you like to meet?" she asked. "There's a Pemex gas station on Highway 57 about 15 kilometers toward Mexico City," Carmen said. "I'm there now." I can only wait another hour. Andrea checked her watch, 11:30 p.m. The drive would take about 15 minutes. She could meet Carmen, get her information, and still have time to investigate the highway during the critical hours. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Andrea promised. How will I recognize you? I'll wait in the parking area near pump number 3, Carmen said. I'm wearing a red jacket. The call ended, and Andrea quickly gathered her recording equipment, notebook, and car keys. She sent a quick text to her colleague Carlos back at El Universal, informing him of her plans, a safety precaution she always took when meeting unknown sources. The night was surprisingly clear as Andrea drove her Honda Civic out of San Juan del Rio and onto Highway 57. The full moon bathed the landscape in silver light, casting long shadows across the deserted road. Few other vehicles were out at this hour, just the occasional long-haul truck heading toward the capital. As promised, the Pemex station appeared about 15 minutes into her drive, its bright fluorescent lights creating an island of harsh illumination in the surrounding darkness. Andrea pulled in and parked near Pump 3, scanning the area for a woman in a red jacket. The station was eerily quiet. A sleepy attendant manned the small convenience store, and a lone trucker was filling his thermos with coffee inside. But there was no sign of Carmen Diaz. Andrea waited in her car for 5 minutes, then decided to check the store. Perhaps Carmen was inside, though she had specifically said she would be waiting by the pumps. The attendant confirmed he hadn't seen any woman in a red jacket, and he'd been on shift since 8 p.m. Returning to her car, Andrea tried calling the number Carmen had used, but there was no answer. A sense of unease began to creep over her. Had she been set up? Was someone attempting to lure her to an isolated location? As she contemplated her next move, a black pickup truck slowly pulled into the station, stopping at Pump 4 adjacent to her car. The driver, a middle-aged man with a thick beard and baseball cap, didn't exit the vehicle to pump gas. He simply sat there, engine idling, watching her through the darkness. Andrea's discomfort intensified. She decided it was time to leave. Carmen had either changed her mind or had never intended to meet in the first place. Either way, Andrea wasn't going to wait around any longer. She started her car and pulled away from the station, noting in her rearview mirror that the black pickup was also leaving without having purchased any gas. It followed her onto the highway, maintaining a consistent distance behind her. Just a coincidence, Andrea muttered to herself. He's headed the same direction. But when she accelerated, the pickup accelerated too. When she changed lanes, it followed. It kept a steady distance, not close enough to be threatening, but close enough that she couldn't ignore its presence. Fear began to bubble up in Andrea's chest. Was this how the disappearances began? With someone following an isolated traveler until the perfect moment to strike. She considered turning around, heading back to San Juan del Rio, but that would mean passing the black pickup. Instead, she decided to continue toward Mexico City, hoping to encounter more traffic or a police patrol. 10 minutes later, the road remained deserted, and the pickup continued its pursuit. Andrea's phone showed no signal, exactly as the families had reported in the cases of the disappeared. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed her car faster, hoping to outrun her pursuer. Then, without warning, her engine began to sputter. The gas gauge, which had shown a nearly full tank when she left town, now hovered near empty. "Impossible," she gasped, tapping the gauge. It had to be malfunctioning. She'd filled up that morning. The car began to lose power, slowing despite her foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. The black pickup drew closer. In desperation, Andrea spotted an emergency pull-off area ahead, a small paved section designed for vehicles to stop safely in case of breakdown. She guided her failing car into it, hoping that the prospect of witnesses would deter whoever was following her. But the black pickup also pulled over, stopping directly behind her, headlights illuminating her car's interior through the rear window, momentarily blinding her. Andrea locked all the doors frantically, trying to restart her engine. It made a weak attempt to turn over, then died completely. She was trapped. In her rearview mirror, she saw the driver's door of the pickup open. A tall figure emerged and began walking toward her car. In the harsh glare of the headlights, she couldn't make out his features, only his imposing silhouette. She reached for her phone again, still no signal. She rummaged through the glove compartment looking for anything she could use as a weapon, but found only registration documents and a flashlight. The figure stopped about a meter from her car, standing motionless in the beam of his own headlights. Andrea couldn't see his face, only the outline of a man who seemed unnaturally still. Then he spoke, his voice carrying a strange, echoing quality, as if it originated from a much larger space than the roadside where he stood. "Andrea Vasquez," he said. "Finally we meet." A chill shot through her. How did he know her name? "I am Javier," he continued. "But perhaps you've heard of me by another name, El Transportista." El Transportista, the transporter. The name from the bartender's ghost story. This had to be some kind of sick joke, someone who had overheard her conversation at the bar and decided to frighten her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she called through the closed window, trying to keep her voice steady. "Please leave me alone." "You've been investigating the disappearances," Javier said, his voice maintaining that unnatural resonance. "You've been seeking the truth, and now you've found it." "So you're responsible for those missing people?" Andrea asked, her reporter's instincts momentarily overriding her fear. If she could keep him talking, perhaps another vehicle would pass by. Javier laughed, a sound unlike any human laugh, deep, hollow, and somehow fractured. "I don't cause the disappearances. I am the disappearances. I am the guide who takes them across." "Across what?" Andrea asked, though she feared she knew the answer. "Across the boundary of life," he replied. "Across the boundary of time. To the place where lost souls like me, like them, and like you belong." "I don't belong there," Andrea protested. "I'm alive. I have work to do." "That doesn't matter," Javier said dismissively. "You have entered my path at this hour on this night. Like the others, you are returning from a journey. And like me, long ago, you stopped to help someone, Carmen, whom you believed needed your assistance. But Carmen doesn't exist. She is merely a name I use to lure people like you away from safety." Andrea felt as if all the air had been sucked from her lungs. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a nightmare, a hallucination, anything but reality. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I have no choice," Javier answered, his voice now containing a profound sadness. "I am trapped between worlds, condemned to drive this road eternally. And to find release, I must collect other souls, travelers like myself, people returning home. People who would stop to help a stranger." "I still don't understand," Andrea said, though a terrible comprehension was beginning to dawn on her. "Let me show you," Javier said, stepping closer to the car. As he approached, Andrea could finally see his face beneath the baseball cap. What she saw made her blood freeze in her veins. It wasn't a human face, not entirely. It resembled a mask formed from smoke and shadow, with eyes that glowed from within. Looking into those eyes, Andrea felt herself falling into an endless abyss. "Look into my eyes, Andrea," Javier commanded, his voice now hypnotic. "See what I have seen." Against her will, Andrea found herself staring into those bottomless eyes. And suddenly she was no longer in her car, but witnessing a scene from 20 years ago, a younger Javier, a dedicated truck driver stopping to help what appeared to be a woman in distress by the roadside. She watched as the woman revealed her true nature, not La Llorona, as the bartender had suggested, but something older, darker, a creature that fed on kindness and transformed it into eternal servitude. She saw Javier being dragged into a liminal space between worlds, forced to become what the creature had been, a collector of souls, a transporter of the living to the land of the dead. She witnessed his first reluctant victims, his growing acceptance of his fate, his transformation from human to something else entirely. And then she saw the others, all 12 people who had disappeared on this highway over the past 3 years. She saw them stop for someone who seemed to need help, saw Javier reveal his true nature, saw them become part of his spectral convoy, forced to follow him in his endless journey along Highway 57. "No," Andrea whispered, tears streaming down her face as the visions released her. "Please don't. I have family, friends. I have a story to write." "They all did," Javier said, his voice sympathetic despite its otherworldliness. "But that is how the curse works. I cannot stop it any more than water can stop flowing downhill." He extended his hand toward her, no longer a human hand, but a construct of smoke and shadow formed into the shape of fingers. "Come with me, Andrea. It won't hurt. And you won't be alone. We will drive together forever." Andrea felt an invisible force pulling at her as if her very essence was being drawn out of her body. She struggled against it but found herself paralyzed, unable to move or scream. Just as she felt herself beginning to separate from her physical form, a flash of headlights appeared on the highway. Another vehicle was approaching, a larger truck, newer and more substantial than Javier's. It was traveling at high speed and showed no signs of slowing. Javier turned toward the lights, momentarily distracted by their sudden appearance. In that instant, the invisible pull on Andrea's soul ceased. She didn't hesitate. She unlocked her door and bolted, running into the darkness away from the road. She heard Javier call her name, his voice now filled with rage and disappointment. Andrea ran blindly through the scrubland that bordered the highway, stumbling over rocks and brush, driven by pure survival instinct. She didn't dare look back, didn't stop until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out. When she finally paused to catch her breath, she found herself on a small dirt road that intersected with the highway. And there, like a miracle, was an old pickup truck, a local farmer examining its engine by flashlight. "Señor," she called out, her voice hoarse with fear and exhaustion, "please help me." The farmer, an elderly man with a weathered face and kind eyes, looked up in surprise. "What's wrong, miss? Are you hurt?" "My car broke down on the highway," Andrea explained, deciding that a simple lie would be more believable than the horrific truth. "Could I get a ride to the nearest town?" "Of course," the man said, closing the hood of his truck. "I'm heading to San Juan del Rio. You're welcome to ride along." Relief flooded through Andrea as she climbed into the passenger seat of the old truck. Only when they had pulled onto the highway and were driving away did she dare look back toward where she had abandoned her car. In the distance, she could make out two figures standing beside her, Honda Javier and the driver of the second truck, the one whose arrival had inadvertently saved her. They appeared to be talking, and even from this distance, Andrea could sense the anger and frustration emanating from Javier. As they continued driving, Andrea turned away, unable to watch anymore. She knew deep in her heart that she had escaped something few people ever survived, and she knew that the driver of that second truck who had unknowingly saved her might not be so fortunate. Andrea never wrote her article about the disappearances on Highway 57. How could she? No one would believe the truth, and she had no evidence beyond her own terrifying experience. Instead, she shifted her investigative focus to more conventional stories, corruption, organized crime topics she could understand and prove. But she never drove on Highway 57 again, especially not at night. And whenever she heard about another mysterious disappearance on that road, she knew it was Javier el Transportista continuing his eternal journey, still collecting souls for his phantom convoy. Sometimes on particularly dark nights when she drove other roads, she would spot a black pickup truck in her rearview mirror, its headlights flashing as if sending her a message. A reminder that although she had escaped once, El Transportista was still out there, still watching, still waiting. And perhaps one day on a deserted road when she least expected it, they would meet again. And next time there might not be another truck to save her. In the years that followed, Andrea's investigation into the Highway 57 disappearances became something of a legend in journalistic circles, the one story the fearless Andrea Vasquez had abandoned without explanation. Some speculated that she had been threatened, others that she had hit a dead end. Only Andrea knew the truth. She had stared into the face of something beyond human understanding, something that existed in the liminal spaces between life and death. She had glimpsed a world where urban legends came to life, where kindness could be a death sentence, and where the boundaries between realms grew thin enough to cross under certain conditions. Andrea never stopped being a journalist. She continued exposing injustice, giving voice to the voiceless, shining light into dark corners of society, but she carried with her a knowledge few others possessed, that some corners are dark for a reason, and some stories are better left untold. And on nights when the moon was dark and the roads empty, She would sometimes catch herself listening to her car radio with unusual intensity, fearing the moment when the static might clear and a voice might call her name, inviting her to join the eternal highway that runs parallel to our own, where El Transportista and his convoy of lost souls drive on forever through the endless night.